Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right, today we're going to cover one of the most influential men in American Mafia history. The organization he formed in the 1920s will become the biggest of the five families in New York, the Genovese family. Some of the most famous names in the Mafia were subordinate to him. Guys like Charlie Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Al Capone, and Frankie Yale. He was the most powerful gangster in America until he wasn't. In this video, we're going to discuss how Giuseppe Masseria became Joe the Boss. Giuseppe Masseria was born in Mafia on the south coast of Sicily on January 17, 1886, to Giuseppe and Bettina Masseria. He was the ninth out of 13 children born to the couple. While still a child, his family moved, and he spent his youth in Marsala before the family made its way to the U.S. in 1902. Joe grew up to be short and barrel-chested. Some would say that he was fat, but either way, he was surprisingly nimble and athletic for his size, and it was said that he was able to do cartwheels and flips. These talents will prove useful down the line. The family settled at 217 Forsyth Street in Manhattan. Joe quickly fell in with the criminal element that ruled the streets of New York at the time. He started his criminal career around 1905 as a burglar. And in 1907, he was arrested along with Giuseppe Lima and charged with the burglary of an Elizabeth Street apartment. He was given a suspended sentence. On August 1st, 1907, Joe was with his cousin, Calogero Masseria. They were sneaking on a fire escape of a tailor they had threatened to do harm if he didn't pay them. When the man saw them, shots rang out. The tailor fired several shots, but he hit nothing. A patrolman, Thompson, was walking by, and he came rushing in when he heard the shots. He found Calogero Masseria, Sr., Joe's uncle, visibly shaken. He told the officer that his son and nephew had threatened to kill him if he didn't pay them. Joe and his cousin were arrested and charged with making death threats. Nothing came of this. Maybe his uncle changed his mind, but the charges were dismissed, and Joe and his cousin were released. The next few years, Joe ran with a burglary gang made up of men mostly from Castellammarese del Golfo, Sicily. We'll get back to that later. He operated a saloon with his wife across the street from their home on Forsyth Street. This was the gang's headquarters where they plotted out their heists. One of the crimes they were involved in was kidnapping. Now, I don't mean kidnapping of other gangsters. Joe was involved in an interstate wholesale kidnapping operation. Every day, gang members would go out and abduct or attempt to abduct Italian children. Regardless if their parents had money or not, they were willing to take the chance. 6 children were snatched and held for up to 2 months until the ransom was paid. In 1906, son of Italian banker Giovanni Bazzuffo was taken and held in an empty apartment for several days. The kidnappers wanted 20 grand for his son's release. When word got out, there was a run on Bazzuffo's bank. Customers were worried that their money would be used for the ransom, but Bazzuffo put them at ease by letting them know that he had more than enough for the ransom. Giovanni Bazzuffo had been harassed by black-handers for years. His life had been threatened, and several properties he owned had been bombed over the past few years. When Giovanni's son was able to escape the kidnappers, the person responsible for letting him get away was found shot and stabbed to death and floating in the Morris Canal, not far from Jersey City. Giuseppe Rufino, Sebastian Di Gaetano, and Joe Masseria were some of the many men brought in during the kidnapping operation investigation. But again, nothing came from this, at least for Joe. On November 13, 1911, Joe was in Passaic, New Jersey, with Charles Clintoni and another man. It was 8:30 in the morning, and they had just finished placing the ladder up to the window of an apartment rented by Samuel Vazzano. A neighbor's yell brought the police running in. 2 officers quickly apprehended the unnamed man while he was trying to run down an alley. The officers handed the unknown man to a civilian for safekeeping while they went to the back of the house. There they arrested Joe and Charles Clintoni. When the police and their prisoners went back around front, they found that the unknown man was gone. See, after the cops left him with the civilian, he pulled the gun and pressed it to the civilian's chest. He told him to back up and remain silent as he walked away and made his escape. Joe and Charles were taken and held without bail. No further information on what happened, but I know he didn't do any time for that. Despite Joe being on the chunky side, he was a cat burglar. And from January 6, 1912 to April 14, 1913, him and his gang were responsible for at least 12 burglaries in the New York, New Jersey area. Late on the night of April 13, 1913, a woman living at 150 Elizabeth Street heard men working on a wall in the rear of the pawn shop owned by John E. Simpson at 164 Bowery. In the pawn shop was a vault containing $500,000 in jewelry and other valuables. The next morning, she looked out of her window and saw that there was a hole in the wall behind the pawn shop, and she called the police. On the 14th of April, police entered into a first-floor apartment at 150 Elizabeth Street. They found Joe and 3 others. The tenement was directly behind the pawn shop on the next street. The gang had made a hole in the Elizabeth Street building and were about to make a similar hole through the pawn shop wall. The police found a makeshift scaffold and about $400 worth of burglary equipment. Joe was arrested, and through the use of new fingerprint technology, it was found that his prints matched those found on tools left at a robbery in 1907. Despite flashing the judge and the jury his big smile full of gold teeth, he was found guilty and sentenced to 4.5 years in Sing Sing. Now, at the time Joe was going away, the New York Mafia was going through a change. For years, it had been controlled by Giuseppe Morello and his stepbrothers, the Terranovas, and his stepbrother-in-law, Ignazio Saetta Lupo, better known as Lupo the Wolf. The Morello/Terranova stronghold was in Harlem on 107th Street, and Lupo controlled the Little Italy neighborhood in Manhattan. In 1910, they were sent away for 25 years for running a counterfeiting ring. This left a void in leadership, and that void was filled in 1912 by Salvatore Toto D'Aquila, who started his criminal career in the Bronx but was now residing in Brooklyn. Salvador D'Aquila was born on November 7, 1873, in Palermo Central, in the same town where Lupo hailed from and future mob boss Vincent Mangano lived before heading to America. By the time Joe got back to New York, Toto was entrenched as the boss of bosses. Not only in New York, but he had spies in every Sicilian gang in America. At that time, New York still had 3 major mafia gangs: the remnants of the Morello gang, the Niccolo Schero gang, the future Castellammarese clan, and the Brooklyn Bronx gang run by Toto D'Aquila. Now, there was a faction of former Morello gang who split off and now operated on 116th Street in Harlem. It would later be taken over by Gaetano Reina and would become the Lucchese family. But that's a little bit down the line. When Masseria got out sometime in 1917 or 18, he began to rise in the underworld, and he built his power base in the East Village. When Prohibition hit in January 1920, Joe switched from burglary, extortion, and kidnapping to bootlegging. The Mafia bootleggers did not import booze from Europe like Arnold Rothstein. Many mafioso enlisted neighborhood families to make homemade wine and alcohol. But at the bootleggers' curb on Mulberry Street, you could get connected. It was an open-air bazaar. There you could find sellers and buyers of booze and government permits to withdraw legal medicinal alcohol. You could buy counterfeit labels to put on your brews after you cut it and rebottle it. You could even get contacts to Prohibition agents willing to look the other way for a price. Joe got his booze from here, and he soon became a rich man. Also around that time, Joe was looking to diversify, and he hooked up with a Jewish counterfeiter, but when the man was arrested, Joe got cold feet, and he didn't want to end up like Morello and Lupo, who had just gotten out of jail in 1920 after only serving 10 years. They looked to regain their positions in the underworld. After Morello removed a few men who would not step aside, Toto D'Aquila became alarmed. He put the word out that Morello, Lupo, and 9 others, including Morello gunman Umberto Valente, were to die. Morello, Lupo, and Valente went to Sicily to talk to the bigwigs, who they still owed allegiance to, for help. When they didn't get a positive response, they headed back to New York, ready to take what they wanted. On October 13, 1921, a leader in the Lupo gang, Giuseppe Viserte, known as Diamond Joe Pepe, pulled up to Cafe della Croce di Salvior at 237 Broome Street for a meeting. As he exited his car, shots rang out. Joe Pepe was shot 3 times by a man who surprised him as he walked towards the cafe. Pepe ran into the cafe and took shelter behind a pillar. He pulled his own gun and returned fire at the man who had followed him. Unfortunately, one of his shots went wild and hit an innocent bystander named Louis Rango. Joe Pep and Rango both died on the scene. Pepe was found with several liquor permits, and according to Patrick Downey's Gangster City, Joe Masseria was waiting for him inside the cafe. Perhaps Joe was subordinate to Pepe. After this killing, Joe announced himself as the leader of the Lupo Morello gang. D'Aquila got word to Umberto Valente that he would be taken off the kill list and given control of Little Italy if he killed Nicholas Terranova, Morello's half-brother, and Joe Masseria. Valente accepted the deal and got to work. Now, Umberto Valente was not a man to be played with. It is said that he killed over 20 men, and he did a bit in Sing Sing after being caught and beaten until the police came on September 23, 1913. Umberto and 3 other men were caught trying to light rags soaked in kerosene to burn down a grocery store in a Black Hand extortion plot. The store happened to be on the ground floor of a 5-story tenement with over 200 residents. At around 12:30 a.m., a few men up late playing cards noticed men loitering outside the grocery store. A few minutes later, they heard someone breaking into the store below. The cops responded to the noise of angry neighbors beating the hell out of Valente and his partners. At around 5 in the morning, on May 8, 1922, Nicholas Terranova was walking to his home at 324 East 116th Street. When he was near 2nd Ave, a car pulled to a halt and shots rang out. 9 slugs from a shot-off shotgun entered Nicholas's body. He dropped to one knee, pulled his own gun, and emptied it at the car as it pulled off. The shotguns would be found discarded a few blocks later, and Nicholas would be found dead by the police. The next day, Joe Masseria was walking down Grand Street near the Mulberry Bootleggers curb. It was rush hour and hundreds of people were in the streets. All of a sudden, men appeared from doorways, approached Joe, and shots rang out. Joe ducked into the crowd while 5 men stood in the middle of traffic shooting. 60 shots were exchanged between Joe and those trying to kill him. The shooting took place near a police station, and officers were on the scene, and one officer saw Joe standing on a corner shooting at a man across the street. When his gun was empty, Joe tossed it and ran, but he was grabbed by another officer. His gun was recovered and Joe was taken in. But Silvio Tagliamba was taken to the hospital with a bullet in his back. Now, accounts differ. Some papers say that Tagliamba was the underboss of Valente, and some say that he was with Joe Masseria, and it's more likely that he was with Joe Masseria. But neither man said anything to the cops, so we'll never know. 2 women and 4 men were also struck with bullets, but none were fatal. Tagliamba, however, died a few days later. At the station, Joe produced a gun permit signed by Judge Sailor Strong of the Supreme Court of Suffolk County. In the corner was written, "Unlimited," meaning he could carry anywhere in the state of New York. This was courtesy of Arnold Rothstein. After Tagliamba died, Joe was charged with his murder and sat in the tombs. He was released after a few weeks and was out on $15,000 bond. On the afternoon of August 8th, 1922, Joe Masseria was at his home at 82nd Avenue getting ready to head out for the day. He was unaware of the 2 men who had gotten out of a blue sedan and took seats in the cafe across the street from his house. They had been there for about an hour, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, intently watching Joe's front door. At around 1:30 p.m., Joe emerged from his home and started up the street. The men jumped up from their seats and quickly walked out of the cafe. They fanned out and approached Joe. Joe noticed them and tried to head back home, but before he could, shots rang out. The shooters fired at Joe with revolvers, but the nimble Masseria sidestepped the first bullet and it went through his jacket. He dropped to his knees as another bullet passed through his straw hat, and a third crashed into a glass window of a tailor shop. A fourth hit an innocent bystander named Isidore Butner, who was shot in the throat. The shooters then hopped into the blue sedan and took off. Their timing couldn't have been worse, because at that time, a group of striking tailors were leaving the meeting and several of them tried to stop the car. Without hesitation, the shooters opened up on the crowd and shot their way to safety. 8 people were shot. All were survived except for Jacob Goldstein, 46 years old, who was shot in the heart and died a few hours later. Luckily for Isidore Butner, the man shot in the throat, the shooting took place in front of a doctor's office, and he received immediate care for his wound and he survived. Joe got up, brushed himself off, and apologized to the tailor. He reached into his pocket and peeled off a few $100 bills and gave it to him to fix the window. The police would find Joe in his apartment, shaken but unhurt, except for his new hat. Something had to be done about Valente. On August 11th, 3 days later, Valente was walking north on 2nd Avenue near 12th Street. As he reached the corner, 2 men walked towards him swiftly, diagonally from across the street. When they reached Valente, shots rang out. The men let off 12 to 15 shots at Valente. One of them hit him below his heart. He clutched his chest and tried to make it to a taxi. As he did, he reached for his gun, but he collapsed dead on the running board of the taxi. The crowd, which had scattered when the shots were first fired, now made an attempt to surround the shooters. But they leveled their guns and opened up on the crowd, hitting a street cleaner named Joseph Shepis in the throat and an 11-year-old named Agnes Erringer in the chest. Both would survive. The 2 shooters ran through the basement of 233 East 12th Street, climbed over a back fence, and went through the back of a building onto 13th Street and escaped. Joe Masseria was arrested, but claimed that he was home all afternoon. Joe had gone out and recruited 2 up-and-coming gangsters to handle Valente for him. Charles Lucanea and Vito Genovese. Both will be rewarded by Joe in 1923, along with a few other up-and-comers like Frank Costello and Willie Moretti, with initiation into his family, which already contained big names like Frankie Yale and Anthony Carafano, a.k.a. Lil Augie Paisano. Over the next few years, Joe's stock rose, and Toto D'Aquila's began to fall. By 1926, Toto had retreated back to his native Bronx. Meanwhile, Joe was taking over every racket possible. Through his soldiers, Joe Masseria muscled his way to the top of the grape racket and the poultry racket. Everything brought into the Fulton Fish Market was subject to his tax, and he got a piece of every stick of spaghetti sold in New York. In 1924, Mike Merlo of the Union Sicilian died. Now, I know I mentioned the Union Sicilian a lot, so I just want to give you a brief history of the organization. It was founded in 1895 by Sicilian immigrants in Chicago. The name was changed to the Italian American National Union in 1925 in order to attract Italian Americans from other regions. The union was paying out sick benefits and death benefits and had deposited $100,000 with the Illinois Department of Insurance. It was restructured as a fraternal life insurance group in 1937. It started out with good intentions, but by 1920, it had been infiltrated by gangsters. The union was a lucrative racket, and the person who controlled it would have tremendous power and influence. In Chicago, Al Capone was looking to be that man, but he was not Sicilian. He joined Masseria to appoint men to the leadership of the union that were loyal to them, thus giving them control. The war between Masseria and D'Aquila had cooled. Joe had taken Giuseppe Morello as his consigliere, and a former Morello member named Al Mineo was becoming the power in D'Aquila's former Brooklyn areas. Mineo came to America in 1910, and he was in the D'Aquila family. In the early 20s, he returned to Sicily. But by 1928, he had returned and joined with Masseria and Morello. Joe felt like he was ready to take the top spot in the Italian underworld. On October 10, 1928, Toto D'Aquila took his wife and family to Dr. D. Cascio at 211 Avenue A in Manhattan. Toto and his wife were suffering from heart disease, and they were there for their daily treatments. While his wife and kids were with the doctor, Toto was outside tinkering under the hood of his car. Witnesses say he was approached by two men. When he came from under his hood, harsh words were exchanged, and one of the two men pulled a gun, and shots rang out. 5 slugs tore into Toto's body at close range. The shooters ran off. His wife and his doctor ran out and took Toto into the doctor's office, but it was too late. Toto D'Aquila died at the age of 50. The two men were Al Mineo and his underling Steve Farino. They would take over Toto's operation. At a meeting a few weeks later of all the top bosses, with Morello and Mineo's blessing, Joe named himself as boss of bosses. Joe was at the height of his power. He had a gang that numbered almost 500 men. Any problem that he had, he could just have removed. One of those problems was Frankie Marlowe. Frankie was a friend of the recently deceased Frankie Yale. Go check out the Frankie Yale video. I'll leave the card up in the corner. He was a successful bootlegger in his own right, until he was found shot to death in Queens. Joe was suspected and was a wanted man until he turned himself in. With no evidence against him, he was never charged with the murder. In March of 1930, Joe and his lieutenant Charlie Lucky went to Miami for some sun and fun. On March 1st, they were taking part in a card game run by no other than Jimmy Meehan, the man whose apartment Arnold Rothstein played his last poker hand in. The game was on his third day. Now, Meehan may have been the host, but it was Masseria's and Charlie Lucky's game. Charlie was the bank and the security. He was holding about $60,000 when the Miami police busted the door down with guns drawn. They arrested Joe Masseria, Charlie Lucky, Jimmy Meehan, and several other New Yorkers. Charlie was the only one packing a pistol, and he was charged with carrying a concealed weapon. At the station, both Joe and Charlie were charged with operating illegal gambling. No additional information on this. Around this time, things in the Italian underworld had begun to change. Salvatore Maranzano, a longtime mafioso from Castellammarese del Golfo in Sicily, was leading a group of his fellow Castellammarese in resisting Joe's authority. Soon the rift got out of control and spread nationwide. Gangsters had to choose sides. Neither side would bend, and eventually war broke out. Now, I did a whole video series on the Castellammarese War. You can click on the link right here, and I'll leave it at the end of the video, and it'll take you to the playlist. So I don't want to redo the whole thing, so I'm just going to summarize it for you. By 1930, for the most part, Joe was recognized by the Italian underworld as the boss of bosses. But Salvatore Maranzano had plans on that position. He came to America in 1925 with the backing of the bosses in Sicily. Joe may have truly been the first American Mafia boss. Unlike Morello and Lupo and even Toto D'Aquila, he had no real connections with the old country. His power came solely from his connections in the States. In 1930, things heated up between Masseria and Maranzano. When the war began, Joe had the numbers advantage. His own family, like I said, up to 500 soldiers. His consigliere was Giuseppe Morello, and Charlie Lucky was his underboss. He had control over the former Yale gang through Little Augie Paisano. He had a tentative alliance with Guy Rana and his gang up in Harlem. And through Al Mineo, he had the former Toto D'Aquila gang in his pocket. Even though he had the numbers, by 1931, Joe was losing the war. He had lost many of his allies, including Morello, Rana, and Mineo. He sued for peace and agreed to relinquish power in exchange for his life. Now, Maranzano may have lifted the death sentence, but others in his own circle thought that Joe should be gone permanently. On April 16, 1931, Joe left his house alone, without any bodyguards. This is why I believe Joe thought that the war was off. And he drove to Coney Island to the Villa Nueva Tomorrow, a restaurant owned by mafioso Gerardo Scarpato. He parked his bulletproof car in a garage down the street and walked a half a block to the restaurant. Now, Joe has survived numerous attempts on his life throughout his criminal career. And if the war was on, he was not moving like it. Joe entered Scarpato's, where he found two men waiting. The trio were joined by a fourth after a few minutes. The quartet ordered a lunch of fish, and Scarpato sent his mother-in-law to purchase the fish from the market. While they were waiting, one of the men pulled a deck of cards, and they began a game of pinochle. At around 3 p.m., Scarpato decided to take a walk on the beach so that the men could talk in private. At around 3:30 p.m., a dark blue sedan pulled up out front of the restaurant, and two men got out. They walked into the restaurant and quickly went to the back where Joe and his party were. In the dining room, Joe was sitting with his back to them, and then shots rang out. Two men opened up on Joe with .38s, hitting him 5 times in the back of the head, the neck, and the back. Joe fell to the floor dead. The two shooters ran back to their car and drove off. The men who were with Joe also took off, dropping their guns in the alley behind the restaurant before they too drove off. You may have been told that Charlie Lucky Luciano was playing cards with Joe and he went to the bathroom right before the killers entered. But this is false. There are no accounts of Charlie being interviewed by the cops like the stories say. Joe was discovered by Scarpato and his mother-in-law, and they were the only two present when the police arrived. But again, check out the Castellammarese series. I go more into depth into that whole situation. That night into the next day, armed men were stationed outside of Joe's apartment at 15 West 81st Street to protect his wife and children till Joe's oldest son returned. Joe Masseria's funeral was what you would expect from a gangster of his stature at that time. He was buried in a $15,000 bronze casket at the Calvary Cemetery in Woodside, Queens. A few weeks after Joe's death, the Masseria family would be dealt another big blow when Joe's daughter, Vinetta, who had been ill, passed away. The press jumped on it and said that she died from a broken heart. In 1937, Joe's brother James Masseria would be tossed out of a car with 5 bullet holes. He would not survive. Now, history, even mob history, is written by the victors. And a lot of what has been written about Joe was written by his enemies. According to Joe Bonanno, who was Maranzano's right-hand man during the Castellammarese War, Joe was a fat slob, and you could tell everything that he ate for the past week by the stains on his clothes. But in almost every article about Joe, they compliment how well-dressed he was. Joe was a modern gangster and had no problem with working with non-Italians. He did business with Irishmen like Big Bill Dwyer, Jimmy Meehan, and Jews like Arnold Rothstein. Joe was an Americanized criminal. He wasn't the Mustache Pete history makes him out to be. The name he chose says it all. He wasn't Don Giuseppe Masseria. He was Joe the Boss. And that, my friends, is the skinny on Joe the Boss Masseria. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. I hope you learned some things about Joe that you didn't know. If you like what we do over here at A Few Bad Men, you want to be a part of the gang, you got to bump off that subscribe button. All right, then you got to break that thumb, ring that bell, and set it for all notifications so you don't miss nothing. If you want to slide an envelope upstairs to the boss to help the channel run smooth, the PayPal link is in the description. And for $2 a month, you can help support the channel by becoming a member. Or check out the Patreon channel if you want to see versions of the videos I can't show on YouTube. This is one of those videos. All right, so check out the merch store, get yourself something nice. Stay tuned for the next video. At this time, I haven't decided yet who I'll be doing, so I have a few stories in the chamber, but I haven't picked one yet. So if you have any suggestions for what you want to see next, leave it in the comments. Even if it's one of the old videos that got taken down, I have a lot more info on those guys now, so I would love to do one of those too. All right? So this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I'll see you in the funnies.